My name is Joey Marshall. I'm a PhD student in Purdue University's Department of Sociology. My co-author is Dan Olson, and our paper is entitled Religious Context and Generalized Social Trust in the United States. Let me just give you the conclusion right at the front. I'll tell you what we found and then back up and tell you how we found it. Dan and I find using a combination of data from the 1984 to 2010 general social surveys, and those data are matched to census and other aggregate level data on the cities and counties where the GSS respondents live. So this is a combined data source in a multi-level framework. And these data suggest, and our findings suggest, that the religious composition of U.S. counties and cities predicts the likelihood that GSS respondents will claim that other people can be trusted. In other words, religious context predicts generalized social trust. Specifically, we find that GSS respondents who lived in counties with high proportions of mainline Protestants were more likely than other GSS respondents to claim that other people can be trusted. Same with GSS respondents who lived in high Catholic areas. But GSS respondents who lived in counties with high proportions of evangelical Protestants were less likely to claim that other people can be trusted than other respondents. And we find some kind of interesting and nuanced results with the concentration of historically black Protestant denominations that I'll explain as we go throughout this talk. But what's really crucial about these findings is that the results hold even among people who are not mainline Protestant, not Catholic, not evangelical, and so on. So in other words, GSS respondents in high mainline Protestant areas were more likely to trust than you would expect on average, even if those people were not mainline Protestants themselves. Same thing with Catholics. And GSS respondents who lived in high evangelical counties were less likely to trust, even if those people themselves were not evangelical. So we think this is a genuine religious contextual effect. In other words, that the religious dynamics of counties and cities in the United States are important, and they shape probably all kinds of outcomes, but in this case, definitely generalized trust. The model is that theologies are important not just for individuals who walk into churches and absorb those theologies and believe them, but actually for whole geographic areas who share some proximity to, these numerically dominant religious denominations. I mean, the way that religious denominations and religious beliefs work, they're in the business of creating whole worldviews that shape how people should dress and how they should act, and marital and sexual decisions and politics, and how people should regard the outside world. And these kinds of cultural values can be transmitted through theologies, not only to individual believers, but actually to the surrounding communities too, by just this dissemination of cultural content that comes prepackaged with religious beliefs. And so in that way, we think that religious context is important for shaping what it's like to live in communities, for shaping the local subcultural values that predominate in these sort of local areas. And really, an argument like this, that religious context, not just individual religious belief, matters, is something that I think it's appropriate to be maybe a little bit suspicious of initially. Because if you think about the religious dynamics of the United States, religious groups in this country are distributed non-randomly across the United States. In fact, the religious differences between counties and cities in the U.S. overlap with other kinds of really important differences like poverty and median earnings and crime rates and segregation and all kinds of things that are really important and that do predict trust. So it's tempting and maybe even appropriate to initially see this result not as an effect of religious context, but as an epiphenomenon of, economics or something like that. But in the paper that accompanies this talk, we go to great length, both theoretically and empirically, to try and deal with some of those competing explanations. And what we're left with is a pretty robust finding that holds even when we adjust the models for other things that significantly predict trust. And so when left with this robust finding that we can't explain away, we have a responsibility to try and account for that finding and account for these data. And we do that using tools from the sociology of religion. So I think also it's important to point out that we're not the only people to make this sort of religious contextual argument, right? Even in literature published in the last 10 years suggests And these are just a couple of examples that I've cited here on the screen, but suggest that the concentration of white evangelical Protestants in the United States predicts things about communities like racial residential segregation, and population mortality, and regional divorce rates, and other things like that that are really important. And you know, really, it's not even about the literature published in the last 10 years, but these are old sociological arguments. I mean, I'm thinking like of Max Weber's notion, to really kind of go back to early sociological stuff here, that something about the Protestant-dominated West had something to do with the institutionalization of capitalism in the West. And like Durkheim's observation that like majority Protestant areas of Europe and majority Catholic areas of Europe had different suicide rates, and Durkheim proposed religious reasons for that. And I mean, you know, Weber and Durkheim didn't have access to like multi-level models and really good survey and census data. But they did frame these sort of religious contextual arguments that are echoed here in our research. So in some ways we see our work as providing, you know, more robust answers using, you know, better methods and better data to very sort of old sociological questions. Now we limit the dependent variable of interest in our study to generalized social trust. And this is a dimension, if you're maybe you may or may not be familiar with this, with generalized trust. It's a concept that's supposed to measure trust in anonymous others, in the way that this item is worded is trust in most people. So this is not trust in, you know, close family or friends. That's what's sometimes called particularized trust. But generalized trust, just in most people in general. The way that that's measured in the GSS, and the way that it's measured in a lot of nationally representative survey data, is with a single item measure that's worded like this. Generally speaking, would you say that most people can be trusted, or can't you be too careful in dealing with people? And you can answer like can trust, or I cannot trust, or in the GSS there's a neutral option, it depends. And this item, well, really, there's a mountain of literature on this item. A lot of this is published in ASR. There's sort of a back and forth conversation about what's sometimes called the radius of trust problem, who are most people. And I mean, I definitely do not have time to review all that literature here, but I'll only draw what I think is a reasonable consensus from this literature, which is that generalized trust and items like this pretty much work as advertised. This is a good way to assess trust in anonymous others and most people. And generalized trust is really important. It has a long history in social science more generally, way outside of the sociology of religion. Robert Putnam writes a lot about this. So do a lot of other authors. It's seen as sort of it sort of underpins a lot of the machinations of, not to sell it, but of democracy in general, or not to oversell it, rather. But I mean, all kinds of things like economic exchange depends on generalized trust. If you write a check to someone, they're sort of trusting you, you're trusting the bank, we'll honor that. Economic transactions are all fueled by generalized trust. You know, I think it was maybe Luhmann in the 1970s who said, you know, generalized trust is the reason that you can get up in the morning and leave your home without a weapon. I mean, maybe you do take a weapon when you leave home. I mean, I don't. And the reason is because generalized trust. You trust that people won't be violent toward you. So generalized trust is really important. And we think it's a really nice empirical site to show off the importance of religious context. I think probably religious context predicts all kinds of socially meaningful outcomes. And some of this literature cited here suggests that. But generalized trust is a basic indicator of population wellness. And we think it's a really nice dependent variable for these models. Okay, quickly about the data that we're using. As I mentioned, these are GSS data fitted with aggregate level data. So we have about 21,000 people nested within about 256 areas. And I'm labeling those areas here as counties, but really the General Social Survey calls them primary sampling units, or PSUs. And PSUs are sometimes whole counties, sometimes metropolitan statistical areas, depends on the place and the size of the area. But I'll use the words county and PSU interchangeably in this talk just for simplicity's sake. Again, we've pooled repeated cross-sections from 1984 to 2010 in these data, and the aggregate level data come mostly from the decennial census and the American Community Survey, or ACS estimates, but also we use some other sources like the FBI's Uniform Crime Reports for crime data. Quickly, the dependent variable in all of the models that I'll show in this talk is this single item measure of generalized trust. These are logistic regression models in which 1 equals can trust plus it depends, and 0 equals cannot trust. The focal predictors in all of these models come from the county level, and they are what I'm calling religious population share. And the way that religious population share is calculated is just the proportion of people in a county who are, for instance, evangelical or mainline Protestant. So for evangelical population share, that's just the total number of GSS respondents in an area who are evangelical divided by the total population. Same calculation for mainliners and Catholics and so on. There are other ways to calculate this too. There are whole data sources that have data on religious population share. For a number of reasons, we calculate these measures from the GSS data itself. There's some literature that suggests this is fine. This yields about the same results as using the external data on religious context. You can email me for questions about any of this stuff or read a draft of the paper if you have access to it. We control for a lot of variables at both levels of analysis. And we have some justification for why we include all of this big mountain of controls in the paper, but they all matter for generalized trust. I don't have time to review all of them, but only to mention a couple that are important. So at the individual level, for instance, we're controlling for one's individual level religious affiliation and attendance and the importance of religion. The survey decade, I'll maybe say a little bit more about what we do with time in this analysis. It's a little bit complicated. But for now, I just want to not get mired in the data and just move on to the findings. Now, I have to deal very quickly and ruthlessly with these various religious traditions in this talk, and we go through much more detail in the actual paper. But because it's a brief talk, I have to deal very quickly with these ideas. I only want to say here that I realize that my co-author and I are taking very diverse denominations, and we're grouping them in very broad and internally diverse religious traditions: evangelical Protestant, mainline Protestant, Catholic, and historically black Protestant. And I know that there are criticisms of doing this. However, there is a tradition of grouping respondents or grouping people in this way in the sociology of religion, and the reason for that is that people normally classified as evangelical Protestant, although they may have a lot of differences with one another, they do share some similarities, and the similarities we think are important, in this case particularly for predicting generalized trust. Now, this is a coding scheme that's similar but not exactly identical to the Steensland et al. RELTRAD coding scheme, which they published in 2000 in Social Forces, widely used in the sociology of religion. And the reason that people labeled as evangelical Protestants can be, I think, reasonably grouped together is in aggregate and on average there are some theological similarities. For instance, evangelicals are characterized in the literature as historically emphasizing personal salvation as opposed to, for instance, social justice. So the outside world, the irreligious world, or the non-evangelical world, is seen as bad and depraved and getting worse all the time. And in some ways, it's sort of fundamentally irredeemable. So maybe it's not a good use of our time to go out and try and improve the world through, social justice or secular institutions. Rather, maybe it's better to go out and just try and rescue as many souls as possible through salvation before it's eternally too late. So Troy Blanchard in a 2007 ASR paper about religious context and racial residential segregation characterizes something that he calls as he describes something called a closed community thesis, in which very close in-group bonds among evangelical Protestants to the exclusion of out-group bonds creates a kind of network closure that in his case predicts segregation. In our case, we think predicts lower generalized trust. So that's why we predict this negative relationship here. And in fact, that's exactly what we find. So quickly, let me explain the values here on the screen that are in red. So this number, minus 18.21% with asterisks here to indicate that this value exceeds or is far enough from zero to sort of exceed any threshold, reasonable threshold for statistical significance. What this represents is the percent change in the odds of trusting others based on a 1 standard deviation increase in proportion evangelical Protestant. So at the county level, given a 1 standard deviation increase in proportion evangelical Protestant, there's an individual level decrease in the odds of trusting others, and the effect size there is 18.21%. Now this is just a bivariate model. Now these models increase from complexity as we go left to right here across the screen. So in model 2, we adjust for PSU level or aggregate level controls. In model 3, we adjust for individual level controls. And in model 4, we adjust for a special block of controls that measure racial residential segregation. This will be important later on. Now as we adjust the models for all of those things, the effect holds, but the magnitude of the effect is reduced in size to about 5.2%, and that's measured somewhat imprecisely. The p-value there is 0.05 followed by a digit. But what's really important is the final column here of these models, model 5, and it's shaded in gray. And what this value represents is the percent change in the odds of trusting others, like the other values, given a 1 standard deviation increase in proportion evangelical Protestant. But here the sample is limited only to non-evangelicals. So among non-evangelicals in the GSS, a 1 standard deviation increase in proportion evangelical is associated with an 8% decrease in the odds of trusting others. Again, just among non-evangelicals. So evangelical Protestant population share negatively predicts trust among non-evangelicals. That's what we can take away from this model. Now we find an inverse effect among mainline Protestants. So mainline Protestants and the groups characterized as evangelicals share a lot of theological tenets, but we believe they have sort of fundamentally different orientations toward the outside world, such that mainline Protestants are much more motivated to, and historically are, engaged in social justice efforts to improve the world around them, and in fact engage in a lot of what Putnam calls bridging rather than bonding social behavior. And because of these differences between mainliners and evangelicals, we predict a positive effect here on generalized trust. And that is, in fact, what we find. So a 1 standard deviation increase in proportion mainline Protestant is associated with about a 5 or 6% increase in the odds of trusting others, even among non-mainliners. We find the same result, interestingly, among Catholics. And because I'm moving quickly, I don't have time to discuss why I think we find this finding, but I do think this is an interesting part of our paper. And the effect size here is even stronger than among mainline Protestants. So a 1 standard deviation increase in proportion Catholic is associated with about an 8% increase in the odds of trusting others, even among non-Catholics. Now the final part of our research deals with the concentration of historically black Protestants. And I think this is a really interesting part of our paper. And this required us to go back to the literature and back to the data to dive more deeply into what could be going on here in our findings. So we began with mixed expectations as to what black Protestant concentration might do in terms of generalized trust. On one hand, there's a body of literature, like for instance Lincoln and Mamiya sort of famously, which suggests that black Protestant churches are really important for communities. They engage in a lot of community revitalization and after-school programs and networking with other orgs in the community, and those are all sort of trust-enhancing effects. But on the other hand, it's true to, I think, a pretty large extent that historically black Protestant churches do share some theological beliefs with white evangelical Protestants. And to the extent that those beliefs predict mistrust among white evangelical Protestants, they might predict mistrust among historically black Protestants. And actually in some analyses that we don't display here, we do disaggregate black Protestant tradition into Methodist, black Baptist, and black Pentecostal denominations, and all the results are about the same as what I'll show here. Now the only really breadcrumb we had to follow in the literature, really the only empirical finding that came close to what we were trying to do, was from Robert Sampson. So in his, what I think is a landmark book, Great American City, Sampson displays this graph, and he doesn't say a lot about it, just a few paragraphs, but what this is a scatter plot with a fitted regression line. And all of these plot points are majority black communities. I think they're communities in which 75% or greater of the population is black. What's on the y-axis here, the dependent variable, is trust in neighbors, or something like generalized trust. Not exactly the same. And what's on the x-axis here, the predictor, is church concentration. So in majority black neighborhoods, church concentration negatively predicts trust. This is a different data than what we're using. However, our data shake out about the same way. So the dependent variable here is aggregate trust. The predictor here is Black Protestant population share, and we find this negative effect of Black Protestant population share on trust. But another thing that sort of came to us as we went through this data and thought about this negative effect of Black Protestant population share on trust, we realized that bivariate models are probably not a good way to model this relationship. And the reason is because the concentration of Black Protestant churches probably overlaps very strongly with other structural differences between communities that are the result of a history of racial injustice in the United States. So for instance, American cities tend to be highly segregated, and segregation comes along with the concentration of urban poverty. And a lot of other artifacts, I shouldn't say artifacts because that implies that these things aren't ongoing. A lot of historical and ongoing structural racial inequality in the United States. So what we're not trying to do in these models is essentialize race. What we are trying to do is take account of racial injustice in these models before we jump to conclusions about the effect of Black Protestant population share. So what we did is we took these models in which proportion Black Protestant negatively predicts trust, as you can see here. The effect size is about the same as among mainline Protestants, but it's the inverse effect. It's a negative effect on trust. And we adjust the models for, all the controls, the county level controls, the individual level controls. But finally, we adjust the models for some measures of racial residential segregation. And so there are three variables here in this block, and that's proportion Black, the index of racial dissimilarity, and the index of racial isolation. You can read Denton and Massey's work for more, and the Census Bureau makes some documents available too, for more about what these indices mean. But essentially, when we adjust the model for these measures of racial residential segregation, the effect of Black Protestant population share is no longer statistically different than zero. It's essentially a null finding, and that's true among non-Black Protestants too. So what can we conclude from these models? Well, if there is an independent effect of Black Protestant population share, we're unable to detect it in these models, and that's because proportion Black Protestant, it turns out, and we can demonstrate this in exploratory work that I don't show here, that proportion Black Protestant is strongly collinear with these measures of racial residential segregation. So what we're picking up with proportion Black Protestant is like segregation and other sort of measures of what amount to racial inequality. So segregation is a strong predictor of mistrust. In fact, it washes out the effect of proportion Black Protestant. And if there is an effect of Black Protestantism by itself, other data or other methods are going to have to investigate that. So to return to some final conclusions here, religious context predicts generalized trust in the United States using this combined data source, positive effect of mainline and Catholic population share on trust, negative effect of evangelical population share on trust, mixed findings among Black Protestants. Of course, there are limitations to this study. This is the sort of obligatory limitation section. These data are repeated cross-sections, so they're not longitudinal. We do use repeated cross-sections over a period of time from 1984 to 2010, and we do adjust the models for the year of the survey, or I think in this case the decade of the survey. We're not using a growth curve trajectory model or a structural equation model that can do in a longitudinal way, and that's because these data are not longitudinal, so we're essentially trying to quotes control for time and sort of make a massively cross-sectional model. As an aside, the reason that we use so many survey years is not to increase our number of respondents, but actually to increase our number of areas. The GSS uses a new set of primary sampling units every 10 years. So if we just use 1 or 2 GSS years, we don't have enough clusters to really do these multi-level models. So that's the reason we're using all these survey years. Really better data would be truly longitudinal data that can better assess temporal ordering. And there are other limitations too. The extent to which generalized trust, really measures generalized trust. There's a whole literature on this. I really don't want to just go into, every study has limitations. We just see this as an initial foray, in our case, into this work on religious context, the idea that the religious dynamics of counties and cities are important and they're socially meaningful, and that research on communities and even on individuals in the United States ought to pay attention to this. That in many ways the local subcultural values that predominate in an area, including but not limited to generalized trust, are a product, we think, of the dominant religions in those areas, and that effect isn't reducible to some epiphenomenon of class or crime or whatever. But we think this is a truly independent religious contextual effect. I look forward to any questions you may have. I didn't include my email earlier, but it's marcia58@purdue.edu. Please feel free to send an email. Let me know if you have questions or if you're interested in this work. I'd be happy to keep you updated on what we do with this in the future. And thank you for watching this video.